Alan Ladd Jr. saw it, who was the head of 20th Century Fox, and he said, "I love this movie. You're very talented, and what do you want to do?" And I said, "Well, I'm trying to get this space thing off the ground." I came to the reality that I was going to have to cut this into 3 pieces and do the first 2 hours, and then hope somehow, some way, I'd get the other 4 hours made. But in order to do that, I sort of managed to get the sequel rights and licensing rights and all the other things for the film so that I could make enough money or promote the film with the licensing and everything to make the film successful enough to where I could get the next one made, which is all I was worried about at that point, was to be able to get all 3 of these films made, which at the time seemed impossible. It just didn't seem like anybody would ever... we expected the first film not to do that well, and so you're constantly on the defensive. You're constantly trying to say, well, if this one doesn't do well, how am I going to get the next one made? And as it turned out, the film was successful. I didn't need that, but what that gave me was a chance at independence after Star Wars came out. And I looked at it and I said, I have a chance now to become really independent from the system, the studio system. I don't have to go to them for the money. I don't have to go to them for permission. I don't have to do anything. I'm going to set myself up now using the profits from Star Wars to build a company completely independent up here in San Francisco.
Not so long ago, in a galaxy not so far away, politics have shaped the fates of empires for generations, dictated the lives of billions, and laid the foundations of a billion-dollar sci-fi opera. If you've been a Star Wars fan during the mid-2010s and early 2020s, then you would know about the constant rise of anti-SJW YouTubers and conservative film reviewers, as well as the term woke and political when describing the sequel trilogy's usage of a diverse cast. However, I should state some major important facts. 1. Non-white actors do not make a series political. 2. The series has war in its name. In truth, the Star Wars sequels are actually the least political out of all of the Skywalker saga films, at least in comparison to the prequel trilogy and the original films. George Lucas conceived Star Wars during the events of the Vietnam War, the Nixon administration, Watergate, and the growing distrust of political institutions. The original trilogy may have worn the cloak of fantasy, but its heart beat with the urgency of real-world rebellion against tyranny. And then came the prequels, a deeply political trilogy that dissected the fall of the Republic and the rise of dictatorship, echoing the fall of Rome, the rise of Nazi Germany, and even the post-9/11 landscape. But the sequel trilogy is actually less political than the original 6 films, and that is a bad thing. If you want to learn why, then stick around to the end.
You did something very interesting with Star Wars, if you think about it. The good guys are the rebels. They're using asymmetric warfare against a highly organized empire. I think we call those guys terrorists today. We call them Mujahideen, we call them Al-Qaeda.
When I did it, they were Viet Cong.
Exactly. So were you thinking of that at the time?
George Lucas conceived the idea for Star Wars in 1971. He wrote the story with the current Vietnam War in his mind, which had been going on for 17 years at this point. Star Wars: A New Hope came out 2 years after the war had ended. The Vietnam War was a major conflict between the Democratic Republic of Vietnam in the north, backed up by communist powers in China and the USSR, against the Republic of Vietnam in the south, backed up by powers like the USA, South Korea, and other anti-communist powers. It was one of the many proxy conflicts in the Cold War, America's fight against the spread of communism. Today, the Vietnam War is a very polarizing topic, with some saying it was a brutal colonial campaign by a federal empire, and others claiming it was a needed step in the fight against communism. For this video, we're taking the first argument to heart. Lucas explicitly stated that the relationship between the Rebel Alliance and Galactic Empire was heavily inspired by the Viet Cong and the US Army.
We're fighting the largest empire in the world.
Right.
And we're just a bunch of hayseeds in coonskin hats that don't do nothing.
That's right.
And it was the same thing with the Vietnamese.
Yep.
The irony of that one is in both of those, the little guys won.
Right.
And the big highly technical empire,
The English Empire, right?
the English Empire, the American Empire,
Yeah.
lost.
Yeah.
This anti-imperialist sentiment is woven throughout the original trilogy. The Galactic Empire, with its overwhelming military might and authoritarian rule, serves as an allegory for American imperialism. It's much clearer in Return of the Jedi, where we see primitive natives like the Ewoks hiding in the trees, ambushing stormtroopers, which were literally the name of elite Nazi soldiers, with blasters. It's even more apparent when you look at Palpatine himself, who was inspired by one of the most polarizing figures of the 20th century. While today Donald Trump is one of the most corrupt and imperialistic presidents of our time, around the time Star Wars was in production, the most corrupt president in US history was none other than Richard Nixon.
American politics has always been behind these films. People have read in from the very beginning. They read in the relationship between the US and the Soviet Union, Watergate. Now, in this episode, without quite being Michael Moore, it is very political. There are references to have we become what we feared. There are references to the State of the Republic. How intentional was that for you?
The thing about democracy is if you don't treat it well, if you don't do your job, especially if you're a representative in the Senate or the Parliament or whatever, the whole thing can go awry, because if you're always bickering and not agreeing on things and doing the people's work who elected you, a tyrant will come in and take over and do it for you because the people want to get the job done.
And I want to say this to the television audience. I made my mistakes, but in all of my years of public life, I have never profited from public service. I've earned every cent. And in all of my years of public life, I have never obstructed justice. And I think, too, that I can say that in my years of public life, that I welcome this kind of examination, because people have got to know whether or not their president is a crook. Well, I'm not a crook. I've earned everything I've got.
The prequel trilogy delves deeper into political themes and is far less subtle about it, exploring the decay of democratic institutions and the rise of authoritarianism. The Galactic Republic's transformation into the Empire is orchestrated through political manipulation, mirroring historical events such as the rise of fascism in Europe. This couldn't be more apparent with Sheev Palpatine, the main antagonist of the franchise, whose rise to power bears striking political trajectory to former US President Richard Nixon. Nixon got power for his first campaign by sabotaging peace talks in the First Vietnam War, telling the South Vietnamese to hold off for better terms when he takes office, which never came up. And as such, over 100,000 Americans and 1 million Vietnamese were killed in the 4 years he protracted the war. This is similar to what Palpatine does in the prequel trilogy, by playing both sides of the Separatist War so that he could slowly take over the Senate and eventually become emperor. The Clone Wars draws parallels to the American Civil War, with the Confederacy of independent systems resembling the Confederate States of America, a collection of systems who are ruled by greedy capitalists who want to control everything while profiting off slavery. Lucas uses this backdrop to examine how political leaders can exploit crises to consolidate power, reflecting on concerns about the erosion of democratic norms, something that is becoming more and more relevant today. Moreover, the prequels critique the role of corporate interests in politics. Entities like the Trade Federation and banking clan have significant influence over the Senate and later the CIS, highlighting the dangers of corporate overreach in the government.
After reading more of Joe's books, I began to understand how I could do this. It was a great gift, and a very important moment. If I don't, it's possible that if I hadn't run across that, I would still be writing Star Wars today.
In contrast to this, the sequel trilogy exhibits a noticeable decline in political commentary. While it introduces the First Order and the Resistance, it's never explained if the First Order is a government system or a terrorist organization, and it doesn't explain why there would even be a need for a resistance if there already is a republic. This is because the films provide limited context for these entities, lacking the intricate political narratives of their predecessors. It's clear that Disney's Star Wars wasn't based on politics as most of the fanbase claims, but instead they wished to remake the magic of the original Star Wars trilogy. Something that is very apparent with how the three movies are a shameless copy and paste of the original trilogy, only with less struggles. It's a failed rehash of Joseph Campbell's hero's journey, a form of storytelling that George Lucas was a massive prophet of. The sequels do a subpar job at trying to recapture the magic because of major factors, from Rey's lack of struggles to how she's the same by the end of the films. She even goes back to Tatooine and buries the Skywalker lightsaber in the one place in the universe both Anakin and Luke lived in misery. And that's ignoring the plot hole of how the lightsaber was even found, when the whole reason Luke made his own was because it disappeared on a gas giant. If I had my honest-to-God opinion on the films, they aren't bad movies. Good acting, good CGI, clearly made by competent directors, and very well edited, but there's nothing in these films that actually justify their existence. All they did was take Luke's original story and copy and paste it to Rey. The only difference is that Rey has less struggles and everything goes right for her, while at the same time undermining the political undertones that made the series so philosophical. Lots of tourists and right-wing fans will claim that the Star Wars franchise has recently become political due to the diverse cast that some of the films have, but we've already discussed why that's a brain-dead take. In other cases, people have tried to claim Star Wars pushed right-wing ideals and that the sequels are too neoliberal, which is obviously not true. In actuality, Star Wars has always been sociopolitical and deep in its storytelling, but Disney wanted to play it safe and try to tell a non-political story with the same wonder that the original films brought. When I saw Force Awakens as a kid, I definitely did get drawn into the magic, but that's only because I was already a fan of the movies and the Clone Wars and the LEGO spin-offs long before Force Awakens. I feel if newer fans watched this movie, they wouldn't get the same feel. One take I keep hearing is how the sequel's lessons is about how fascism will never die or that the First Order are an allegory for neo-Nazis, but I honestly don't see that. I've tried and I can't see it. Star Wars at its core is a reflection of our world's political complexities. From the anti-imperialist sentiments of the original trilogy to the cautionary tales of democratic decay in the prequels. The saga offers valuable insights into the dynamics of power, resistance, and governance. While the sequel trilogy may have shifted focus, the franchise foundations remain deeply rooted in political commentary. As audiences continue to engage in this universe, it's crucial to recognize and appreciate the socio-political narratives that have shaped its legacy. Thank you all for watching. Be sure to leave a like, subscribe, all that sort of stuff, and comment down below if I've changed yours or anyone's minds while watching this video.